parable of the rich fool. Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you've prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God.' And he said to his disciples, 'Therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouse nor barn, and yet God feeds them. Of how much more value are you than the birds? And which of you, by being anxious, can add a single hour to his span of life? If then you are not able to do as small a thing as that, why are you anxious about the rest? Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. Yet I tell you, even Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass, which is alive in the field today, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, how much more will he clothe you, O you of little faith? And do not seek what you are to eat and what you are to drink, nor be worried. For all the nations of the world seek after these things, and your Father knows that you need them. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to the needy. Provide yourselves with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in the heavens that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." This is God's word.
Thank you, Robert. That is God's word, and it should be read that way. All right. Good morning, church. To everyone here on web streaming or whatever it's called, I want to welcome everyone. So incidentally, Dr. Richard's going to be preaching next Sunday, so give you a little heads up. And so come, you would want to hear him deliver God's word. I'm going to be another place preaching, so he's going to be preaching in my place. So, all right, those of you who are here and have been here with us, we are doing a series called The Best News Ever. Man, that's gospel. And so the book of Luke, man, it's got not only amazing stories about Jesus, a lot of parables, but does elaborate. He elaborates really well what the gospel is about. Well, we're in Luke 12, and we're just kind of going chapter by chapter. And today's topic, or the title of this message, is kind of somber. What is life? I mean, man, what a huge statement, What is life, all right? So I promise you it's not just a philosophical sermon, but it'll get real practical real quick. Incidentally, what's interesting is, we've already planned this message, and yet this past week is really interesting how life just comes together. This week, I went to 2 memorial services, one last Monday, and there was one here yesterday. And it's like in God's sovereign plan, it sort of like fits neatly into this message that's been, that I've been preparing, just kind of brewing in my heart as we continue the series, So it really makes sense to talk about life, because life, when you go to funerals, and some of you have been going and been to 2 this week, just you kind of think about that. You can't just forget about the shortness of life. So having thought about that, it reminded me of a book that Chuck Colson had written years ago. Chuck, if you don't know who Chuck Colson is, he was a former aide to President Nixon, and he was the brain behind Watergate, and he went to jail for that. But while he was in prison, he found the Lord. It's done extraordinary work. And he wrote a book years ago called Search for a Good Life. And in it, he begins a story. And he opens the book with a story about an old soldier walking through a cemetery, the Normandy, America cemetery. I have a little picture here. And if you can imagine what that cemetery is like, it's a lawn. It's a picturesque scene. And there's this immense array of headstones there, raised with crosses all over. And if you just count, there are thousands and thousands of these crosses everywhere. And in this lawn, in this cemetery, there's an old soldier walking to a particular cross. And he finally gets to this cross, the headstone. And it's of Captain John Miller. And as he is standing there, he has one question that has been kind of looming all his life, and he was there for that moment. Well, the story goes, behind him as he was walking, trailed his wife, and then also his son and daughter-in-law and little kids there, and they're all following Grandpa here. And he finally gets to that cross that he's been looking for, just to ask this one question. Now, Captain Miller, the backstory is that Captain Miller and his men, they landed on the beaches of Omaha Beach on D-Day, all right? And they had one mission, Captain Miller and his troop. And the one mission is to find a paratrooper named James Ryan. And the mission was to bring him back away from the war, bring him back home alive. What a tall order that is. So General George C. Marshall, the general in World War II, had personally issued an order to save Private Ryan, all right? Because the story is Brian's 2 older brothers had already died in war. One of the other brother had been killed in action in New Guinea. And so General Marshall thought mother giving up 3 sons for the war was just enough. So he gave an order to save Private Ryan. If you know that title, in 1998, Steven Spielberg made a film called Saving Private Ryan, and it is really the retelling of the story. But let me read a short paragraph in how Chuck Colson brings the story together. He says his wife came to his side again, and he looks at her. James Ryan, in his old age, looks at his wife and pleads. He says, "Tell me that I've led a good life." Confused by his request, she responds with a question, "What?" He has to know the answer. He tries to articulate it again. "Honey, tell me that I'm a good man." The request flutters her, but his earnestness makes her think better of putting it off. And with great dignity, she said, "You are." So his wife turns back to the other family members, and they're all ready to leave. Before James Ryan joins them, he comes to attention, and he salutes his fallen comrade. And Colson ends, "What a gallant old soldier he is." So in our text today here, Jesus is addressing a similar existential question, all right, in the parable in the story that we just read, about a good life. not just a good life, but about life itself. And this is what Jesus is addressing here. And in fact, here's the context. We didn't read chapter 12, but in chapter 12, verse 1, as Jesus is going and teaching wherever he goes, it says, I just want to point this out. In the meantime, verse 1, when check this out, when thousands of people had gathered, because they were trying to follow Jesus, getting a glance at him, right? They were trampling one another just to see him. And that was the occasion of this message that we're getting here. So imagine, he's going from town to town, and this time he had a tremendous following because word just got out that he could be the Son of God, but this is an amazing guy. So thousands of people were crowding, and they were trampling over just to maybe touch him or get a sight of him. So you can imagine the chaos. And in that, as all this stuff was happening, Jesus was teaching not only his 12 disciples, but he's also looking out and teaching the whole crowd. And as this is happening, someone in the crowd with a large, imagine thousands, you had to have a really large voice. So this is where Robert would come in and he would animate, "Teacher!" Anyway, whatever. "Teacher." And he's yelling, imagine, out in the open, "Teacher, tell my brother," and he's yelling, "Tell my brother, brother, to divide the inheritance with me." That's what he did. And it caught Jesus' attention. Now, and as we continue here, although the question was about dividing family inheritance and all that, Jesus being the Son of God, not only that, Son of Man, he's a very astute human being. He understood that the question that the man raised was not just about inheritance, but it was about good life. But a good life that he wanted to ensure that revolved around him, a world where he is, and he wants to make sure that he's well taken care of. So Jesus cuts through the fat. He gets what's going on. So what we have here in our text is that he's giving us a reply to that. And he gives us 2 points. And it's a very simple message today. So Jesus responds, what life is not. And then he explains then what life is. All right? So those are the 2 things that I'm going to be addressing today. So first, it's going to take a little longer because he is teaching not only to his disciples, but the whole crowd. Again, it's not just existential philosophical question here, but it's very practical. And he tells us what life is not. And here it is. He addresses that first point. And let me just give you in summary. He says life is not about greed and anxiety. Show us this 2 things. I defined it for you. You know what greed is. Greed is an intense, selfish desire for the things you want. Right? Right. And it could be stuff. It could be tangible stuff. It could be money. It could be cars, houses. Anything that, our consumeristic mind is throwing at us, man, that's stuff, all right? And but greed can also fall into intangible items as well, like power, status, education and status and society. So they're tangible greed, and they're that you can't really see intangible greed. So that's greed. And another thing that life is not composed of, that if you pursue it, you're not going to be satisfied, is anxiety. Now, what is anxiety? We go through it all the time. Let me define it. And anxiety is an emotional reaction, get this, to the things that you don't have, or the things that you don't, that you want so bad. That's anxiety. And anxiety actually was very common today. It's always been, but it was really at a different level today. Anxiety is fueled by uncertainty, and over 2 things: over the problems that you have right now, and which does cause for worry and anxiety, I get it, but anxiety also fuels problems that you don't have, potential problems. So it's like whether you have or not, anxiety rules. And Jesus points these 2 things out in his teaching. He says greed and anxiety, if you live by those kinds of things, that's not living. That's not life, all right? All right. Now, greed and anxiety, I've been thinking about that. And to me, they're not obviously connecting, but the more I thought about it, there is a correlation between greed and anxiety. Because both actually are focused on getting more stuff, more things, storing up for the rainy day, whatever it is. If you don't have it, you get anxious about it. And if you don't, and if you're greedy, you're going to get more of it, right? So you kind of get that. And both in greed and anxiety, what happens is, whether you have it or not, what happens is it keeps your fists tightly clenched with whatever money you have left, or a lot you have, or possessions that you have. The more stuff you get, or the more things you worry about, greed and anxiety, when you live this way, Jesus is essentially saying that then you miss what life is really about. Because what he's going to say at the end is that life is really about the opportunity and joy of releasing the clenched fist and giving your stuff to others. Ooh, did you hear that? I think I'm going to go back to that point. If you really, I'm fast forwarding to what life is about. According to Jesus, I'm not saying this, but according to Jesus, it's giving your stuff away. All right, let's continue. Now you're like, convince me here. And that's what the whole crowd is saying, convince me in a way. And so to convince the crowd, remember there's thousands of people, and even to his disciple, he clarifies his teaching and he proceeds to talk about the two categories of greed and anxiety. And he does that first with a parable. And he gives a parable about a successful businessman. Now in this parable, Jesus paints a picture of this person. He's not a bad guy. He's honest, hardworking. He hustles. And he does whatever it takes. And his labor and the work and the sacrifice that he put in proved to be very fruitful. And as a farmer, that was his dream. He yielded tons of crop, all right? There was so much yield, according to this proverb that Jesus is teaching, that he had to think about what to do. So he had to destroy what he has, build a bigger barn so that he could store all the fruit and the yield for future stuff, which makes total sense, all right? If you're contracting out, like, what should I do? That will be your advice. But the goal of that is really verse 19. And the verse 19, what does it say? It says, then I'll say to my soul, you have ample goods stored up, laid for you for many years. So here it is, guys. Let's relax. Let's eat, drink, and be merry. And parenthesis, let's retire. You know what I mean? So it's like, that's it. You know? What he is dreaming about in his summary, in his understanding of life, that is life. Store up the goods. Eat, what is it? Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Wow, isn't that nice? Now that sounds all good, because that's what we've been told, and I know I've been told that all my life. But you know, it's fine in some way. But here's the problem, because we're looking at the Bible, not my opinion or your opinion or what your grandparents told you. This is what Jesus said. What does he say about verse 19 and that kind of analysis? His analysis is very different from the kind of dream that a guy in the parables dreamt of. It's very different from maybe in the American dream that we're pursuing. I know my parents came to the United States for that American dream, you know, and that's what we're pursuing. But is that the life? And according to Jesus, he would have problems with that, because in fact, in verse 19, Jesus is teaching, actually, that's not life. That's not the life. God's verdict, and in fact, he shows us what God thinks about that in verse 20. God's verdict is that the decisions that this man made, he calls him a fool. But God said to him, fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things that you have prepared, whose will they be? He calls him a fool. Now, understand well that when the Bible uses a fool, that doesn't mean you're a dummy or a nincompoop. Do you guys know what that word is? Anybody use that word anymore? Hardhead, right? Anyway, that's not what he means. God's not calling you a fool. But what a fool is in the Bible means is one who knows God's word but totally disregards it. That's what a fool is. And there's a lot of proverbs and words in the Bible that can validate that. But that's what a fool is. A fool is anyone who knows God, what God says, but does not do it. So this businessman here, this farmer in this parable is a fool because he's religious. And although he knows God, he failed to see what God requires. And in essence, what Jesus is showing him, because he has greed in his heart. Greed or covetousness. And in fact, he begins this whole parable by saying in verse 15, he says, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness or greed. You know, the reason, it's just fascinating, the reason why, out of all the 10 commandments or 7 deadly sins, none of those vices that we carry, Jesus never says, be careful of your pride, or anger, or your lust, or all these kind of things. But he says, but be careful of covetousness. And you know why he says that? Because no one thinks they're greedy. If I say, how many of you have pride issues? Some of you might, a lot of you raise hand. All these other issues, that all the vices and 10 commandments and all that. How many of you violated all that? We would lie. Yeah, I lied. How many of you are greedy? No one thinks that they're greedy. And yet, greed, oh my gosh. If we have this mindset and we're living life like that, if we're not conscious of the fact that Jesus said, be cautious of it. Like examine your heart, right? Because no one thinks he's greedy. This guy doesn't think he's greedy, but his actions, and we get the privilege of hearing what he's thinking. His thinking and his actions prove that greed is what is motivating him with that American dream or the dream that he had. How do we know? If you just look at verses 17 through 19, look at all the first person pronouns. That's all you got to do. You can count it now if you're bored with this message, and you'll find there are 12 incidences of using the first person, either in a possessive form or just the word I. Me, myself, and I. There's 12 times is referred in verses 17, 18, 19. That's 3 verses. So what you see, that is just greed. That is selfishness. What you see is an intense desire for stuff, for more stuff. And for this guy, the goal of amassing more stuff is to enjoy, verse 19, relaxing, the good life, eating, drinking, and be merry. Greed. And think about this, church. Greed, whether you're conscious or not, in God's eye makes you a fool, because your desire for self, for what you want, is so much stronger and so much greater than the things of God. That's why greed it just creeps in and is dangerous. And we don't even know that we're greedy, but that's the result of greed. You do what you want to do over against what God says to do, And not only that, verse 19, as you get all this stuff, it shows, to me, verse 19, enjoying life and being merry and doing all these things for yourself, to me, it's a clenched fist. That's all that is. And this person is not going to share anything that he has with anyone at anywhere and any time. That's why it's dangerous. So Jesus warns us about greed. He says you can spend all your life getting as much as you want and all that, working hard, and that's fine. But the problem is, here's the problem. After you get all the stuff that you want, because you worked hard, this is what Jesus is asking, can you guarantee that you can settle down after you've done all the work and enjoy the good life? Can you guarantee that? Can you guarantee that with all the fruit of your labor that you're actually going to relax, eat, drink, be merry after all your toils? Can you guarantee that? And the answer is absolutely not. None of you can. You don't even have to be a Christian to know that answer. Because you can't control death. If you can, go for it. Death is going to intrude at any time. Again, I referenced this message by saying that I went to 2 funerals or memorial services this week. One on Monday was a natural cause. She was an 83-year-old grandmother, and she died from natural causes. It was sad, but, you expect that. The other one we had yesterday, he died before his time, and it was very sad. Through the eulogy, I understand. We celebrated him. He did well. He had enough wealth. He had family. He had grandchildren. And yet he was still pursuing opportunities, but his life got short. If you could guarantee that wouldn't have happened, I would have said, wow, what a great life, But it got cut short, And that's what Jesus is saying, what greed does in general for all of us. So be careful. Check to see not only what you're doing, what you're working for, but why are you working so hard? Why are you hustling so much? Just ask. Secondly, because greed and anxiety is not the way you're supposed to live this life. Let's look at anxiety very quickly. Anxiety, all right? First of all, we're anxious because, we have to meet our basic needs. Food and clothing is representative of that. Everyone has needs, basic needs, food, water, and shelter. But I was checking it out on social scientists who tell us that it's not just food, water, and shelter anymore when it was very simple. Now we have 9 needs, or maybe more. You look at it: safety, purpose, community, rest, sustenance, love, empathy, creativity, autonomy. My gosh, it's such a complicated society. We, to be healthy, not only physically, but mentally healthy, emotionally healthy, psychologically, we need all these kinds of things now. So there you go for it, right? See, trying to obtain these needs, which are essential, is hard. And struggling to meet those needs often causes anxiety for most of us. Remember, I said anxiety is an emotional reaction to not having what you want, right? And here's the thing about anxiety. Even if you've met these needs, all 9 needs, to your satisfaction, anxiety still comes in because in the back of your mind, it asks this nagging question: what if? What if? What if, even though I have a 6-figure income, I lose my job? Ooh, that's going to hurt. What if the purpose that I had when I was in the peak of my game is gone? What if my kids are not safe anymore, right? What if my community rejects me? On and on. The nefarious thing about anxiety is that even if you've made it, even if all of your needs, your base needs, your emotional needs, everything is, you've achieved it. You're on top of the food chain, right? In wealth, status, materialism, education, you name it. You live in North Shore and you made it. Even if you have all that, the nefarious thing about anxiety is that it steps in to make sure not only that you maintain it, but it whispers, what if? Anything could happen. The stock market will crash. We may have another war. As soon as you turn on the TV, breaking news. No wonder our country is filled with anxiety. No matter how successful you are, or no matter how unsuccessful you are, anxiety doesn't care. It's going to get us. And Jesus gives this argument, and he knows, not even for us, but man, in the first century too, every human being, we go through this. He gives us arguments. Again, he's saying this, if you live this way, you're not really living. And he says, don't worry. Don't be anxious. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of life. It's a waste of your energy. All right? And he gives us 2 examples. Example, verse 24. All right? So he says, don't be anxious about your life, right? Verse 24. First example, consider the ravens. They neither sow nor reap. They have neither storehouses nor barn, and yet God feeds them. ravens. Yeah, we could say a lot here, but Jesus uses the analogy of a raven. Now, why would he do that? First of all, ravens are not the type of birds you would use to illustrate God's provision. Because ravens, whether you like them or not, they consume carcasses of dead animals. They're like vultures. You don't have them as pets. You know what I mean? In fact, even in the Old Testament, they're in the category of unclean animals. They're not thought of. They're not very important in the Old Testament. And in our culture today, ravens are considered bad omens, and it just has bad negative connotations of that. And yet, with that background, when Jesus is telling us not to worry or don't be anxious, strangely, he uses ravens intentionally, I believe, to illustrate how God provides and cares for, here it is, he cares for the most neglected and unclean ravens that you don't even think about, with all the needs, provisions of food and water. Job, when he was suffering, he felt like a raven. And look what he says in Job 38. He asks a rhetorical question. Who provides for the raven his prey when his young ones cry to God for help and wonder for lack of food? Who does that? Not you or I. We don't care about those ravens, but certainly God does. And the argument is this. If a hungry, restless, unclean raven who no one cares about is taking care of God, verse 24 says, oh, how much more value you are than these ravens you don't care about. And if God cares about these even unclean ravens, argument from lesser to greater, how much more are you more important than him to God? So the analogy is, of course he'll take care of you. Do you believe that? Of course he'll take care of you. Having said that, the argument continues. All right? And then he uses the example of Solomon. All right? And he says, King Solomon, arguably the richest man, the wealthiest man, the smartest, brightest person that ever lived. No one will ever be like him or surpass him in history. In wealth, wisdom, building the temple, which was the envy of all nations. I mean, gosh, go look it up in 1 Kings. That is Solomon, right? In this full glory. And yet, check this out. Jesus is saying this. And yet Solomon, in the fullness of his glory and all that he had done for Israel, if you've ever been to Israel today, you're not going to see that glory anymore, because all you're going to see are ruins. You're not going to see his glory. In contrast, when God reveals his beauty and glory and all to the world, he doesn't show Solomon or anything like that. He says, I have a picture of this. Look at the wildflowers. Look at the lilies. Look at I don't know if you've ever driven through the countryside of Pennsylvania or, New York has countrysides outside the city. And you see all these wildflowers and dandelions and sunflowers. And you're like, wow, who planted all this? Who manicured all this? The answer is nobody. It just happened. It happens not only here, but all around the world. God shows his beauty and displays his wonder all throughout without your help, thank you. When human beings get involved and take a beautiful place like that, you know what we get? We get a city. And when we create cities, we go, wow, isn't that amazing? But if you look really deep within cities, you know what you get? You get a bunch of rats. That's what happens when we put our hands on it. But when you see that God puts his hands on it, oh my gosh, it is breathtaking beauty, and you had nothing to do with it. It's God who does all that. So man, can you not worry about doing stuff? Because if you do stuff, you're only going to get rats. But if you let God do stuff, it's going to be amazing. He's going to provide everything. He's going to care for you. It's beautiful. It's glorious. Even Solomon, his prized creation, failed. And none of us could be like that. This is Jesus' argument about anxiety. You can't, and ultimately this is his final blow of why we shouldn't worry. You can't add one more minute to your life, and he calls that a small thing. So why worry about it if you can't do it? Right? That's what he says. But I thought of a corollary that is just as, I think, effective, and it is this. So let's do the positive side. If you can affect change in your situation and cause actually a positive change by worrying, go for it. Worry your life away. Then you'll have extra time and you could actually manipulate God to change your situation. Go for it. If you can do that, God gives you permission to worry. And, well, I don't give you permission to worry, but God does. All right? If you can do that. It's such an absurd, understanding, but that's what Jesus is saying here. So, similar to greed, remember greed is where your desire for self is so much stronger than the things of God. Anxiety, the root of anxiety is also spiritual. It is lack of faith. Because anxiety, the reason why we're so worried and anxious about everything, because who do you trust? Do you trust yourself or do you trust God? And that's where the root of anxiety comes from. And greed and anxiety are both focused, this is what I said earlier, they are both focused on getting more and storing up more for your life. And when you do that, it keeps your fist tightly clenched with the stuff that you have, whether it's a lot or a little, you still hold it, and as a result, greed and anxiety will cause you to miss what life is really about, which is letting it go and giving it away. Wow. Because because we don't do that, that's why we don't really get life. We don't really see the joy of life. If our life is ruled by greed and anxiety, we are not truly living. All right? Okay, good news. How much time? Oh, we're way past time. But anyway, we got to get through this because you need to know how to live life, right? Well, here it is. Let me get it real quick. Verse 30 through 32, it says a lot, but basically let me say this. The key to life is that you have to trust God. And that is living by faith. Not just to get to heaven, which is predominantly what we preach, but also practically, and I told you this get really practical. If you really want to live life, your faith, you have to trust God to meet all your needs, everything. If you really believe that God can do all that, right? And you seek his kingdom, you seek him, then the greed and anxiety that rules us, you know what happens to those things? Just melts away. Isn't that nice? You don't even have to try to say, greed, get away from me. Anxiety, no. Just goes away. Just goes away. Why? Why does it go away? And the answer is because you're trusting in God's, here it is, you're trusting in God's abundance, infinite abundance, treasure trove of blessings that's not just in heaven, but is yours. That's why you can let it go. You know, back in the day, when I was younger and had more hair, we grew up watching The Lifestyle of the Rich and Famous. You guys know that? Okay, some of you are like, who is that? Robin Leach. Actually, sorry, he's a British guy. Robin Leach. Every episode, he showcases the life of the uber rich and famous. And you're like, ugh. And at the very end, he has a tagline of every episode. Do you know this? Champagne. Okay, you don't want to show that. You know. Yes, you know that. Champagne wishes and caviar dreams. Isn't that lovely? and it makes you want to come and see next week who the next big rich people are. And I say this, but look, if you just set aside the judgment for living their extravagant life, and maybe you're jealous, if you just take all that away, the reason why those kind of things are important is because as you just objectively look, the reason why they all look happy when you see them is because, you know what they're doing? They're living out of their surplus. They lack no material things. You want to eat whatever you want. You want to go. You want to live in luxury. You want to sit on a gold plate, well, actually a real gold toilet. You go for it because you can afford it. If you're living out of surplus, relax. Eat, drink, and be merry. Is that life? Well, I almost want to say yes, but it's not. Robin Leach actually shows the glamorous side, but doesn't really show what's the emotional turmoil behind that. But this is life, though. Here's life. Verse 31. Actually, verse 30. Listen, God says, God knows that all nations in the world seek after these things. God knows all that. Your Father knows that you need them. Yes. But this is what life really is. Verse 31. Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. It's very simple. If you understand that, and if you get that deep into your soul, then you're living life. You know why? Because God is the infinite and abundant source of material stuff, emotional needs that you have, psychological needs. Did I say money and material? Yeah, he has all that. All that stuff in the infinite amount. Even spiritual blessings. He has all that. And Jesus says, pursue him. In other words, seek his kingdom, right? And you get everything thrown in. These things will be yours. C.S. Lewis, such a genius writer of the last century, in his book called The Joyful Christian. I hope you know this quote by now. But he says, amen, heaven, and you will get earth thrown in. Isn't that nice? That's exactly what Jesus is saying here. However, the corollary is, you aim at earth, you aim at stuff with greed and anxiety, you get neither. That's kind of cold. But that's the reality. That's exactly what Jesus is saying, all right? That's life. Aim at heaven. Seek the kingdom, and you'll get everything. You get that? Are you living this way? How do you know you're really living this way, that you're truly living the way God intended? And this is where it hurts. Verse 33 to 34. Sell your possessions. Give to the needy. Provide yourself with money bags that do not grow old, with a treasure in heaven that does not fail, where no thief approaches and no moth destroys. Give it. Release your clenched fists and share. By the way, I'm not preaching communism, by the way. I'm just saying what Jesus says, okay? You have stuff. Some of you have a lot more than others. And God bless you with that. Even if you don't have anything, he says, let that, God, pry those fingers off. Unclench them, Because the argument is this. Let me just reiterate the message because it's important. If God is your treasure, he provides everything for you because you're more valuable than these stinking ravens. Whatever you work, whatever you're doing, make sure you're busy in the kingdom work. And when you're making your millions, but you're also doing kingdom work, then you're storing up riches for God, for yourself. Because you know that God is the source. Why do you do that? Because he's a source of abundance. He's not a stingy God. And as you receive more stuff and you amass more stuff, what happens is you use your money, possessions, everything to bless others around you. Actually, that was the message. I should have just said that in the beginning. We'll be done 30 minutes ago. That was it. That's exactly what Jesus is teaching. But whereas greed and anxiety focuses on getting more and storing up for more and holding our, fist tightly, Jesus says, listen, the essence of really living this life. If you really want to know what life is, you want to find the joy of God. It's not necessarily coming to church and praying on your knees and not interacting. It is when you start giving to others, helping others, going beside yourself and investing your life to that. You say, well, of course I could do this. If I have Jeff Bezos' money, of course I'll give you $1. I don't know. Of course I will, right? And we all say that. The answer is no, you won't. Because if you, right now, whether you have much or little, even if you're poor, listen, if you're not giving now, I guarantee you're not going to give anything at all. That's what it is. That's what he says. So verse 33, as I trepidatiously read this verse to you, which is the proof that you get it, verse 33 is not a matter of when do I do this, when do I start giving. It's really a matter of faith. That's all this is. It's spiritual. It's not about how much can I give, but it's about faith. Do I believe this God? Man, I'm going way over. All right. But you know what? I said it melts away. If you get it, check this out. Greed will melt into contentment. You like that? Anxiety, all of us are anxious. You know what's going to happen when you get this? It's going to turn to peace. Isn't that lovely? Because Jesus was the Son of God. Think about this. He had everything. Father created the universe. You know what the Father did? He gave it to his Son. The Son rules the world. He has inherited everything from the Father. And Jesus, in the beautiful community of the Trinity, he had everything. You know what he did? He came down, laid down his majesty, emptied his wealth, glory, splendor, emptied his self to become one of us. He left heaven. And while he was on earth, he was thoroughly tempted by greed and wrestled with anxiety, just like all of us do today. And though Jesus lived this perfect life, to the end, he had to wrestle. And in fact, at the end, he died as a criminal, as though greed put him there. He died with restlessness, he wasn't at peace. Because on the cross, he took upon all of our anxieties, all of our uncertainties, and uncertainties of separating from the Father for the first time and going to hell on our behalf. He went. You see, what you see on the cross is not a sad person who died for us, but what you see is life. Why do we talk about death so much? Because it's only through death you get life. And only through death will your anxiety go away. Not our death, Jesus' death. Your greed is going to melt away. Because the cross is the key to living a full life. To give, and if you get God, if you get Jesus, if you get the gospel, man, you'll give away everything so you can get God. And if you have nothing, God will give you more. And you give all that away, God's going to give you more. Give away all your valuable possessions. Some of you is money. Some of you have enough money, but you know what you got to give? Time. That's even more valuable. That's another sort of sermon. Okay, let's close this down. Pastor John, if you would come up, let me just pray for you. And let's just kind of go before the Lord. As you're setting up, let me just, for a quick minute, just kind of speak with you here. And those of you who are hearing this sermon, if God has convicted you, and I hope he does, because I'm convicted, we're all greedy, we're all anxious. And there are a lot of other sins, but we are that. The question is, how much, we know God, but how much do you really trust him? How much are you showing that you do know God by your actions? I pray, Father, for my brothers and sisters. I pray for my friends. I pray for those who don't really know you yet. And I hope you're opening up our hearts. I pray, Father, that faith, Lord, is not just a vertical spiritual relationship with you and us, but Lord, it is also horizontal. It is giving away not only our time, money, resources, but ourselves to those who need it. Lord, I pray not only individually we get convicted, but Lord, as a church, as our church, and the Church of Jesus Christ, that we'll be able to give away everything as much as people need. And I pray that you will build that within the core value of our church, so that everyone that has need, just like the early church, that people will bring the proceeds of their selves to the feet of the apostles, and they just gave it away. And that's why unbelievers to notice that you are special, Jesus. You don't hoard glory for yourself, but you give it away. You've given it away to us. Transform us so that we can give away to others that need it. Would you do that today? Would you convict our hearts for that so that we might be a blessing to our community? Lord, keep working on our hearts, God, and hear our prayers. In Jesus' name.